Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm Sarah Green. I'm the program manager for Barnard Teaches. First, I'm going to introduce you to Barnard Teaches, then you'll hear from the panel, and finally, we hope to have about 10 minutes for questions at the end of our discussion. All right, so we're here to talk about the past, present, and future of Barnard Teaches. So what is Barnard Teaches? It's a series of 8 courses made possible by a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and Barnard Teaches connects the college to major New York City institutions, grants students access to curators, archivists, and collections, and supports innovative, digitally minded pedagogy. Each course has place-based and digital components. That means students learn on-site at New York City institutions. Digital components of the course enhance and enrich the learning experience, and collaborations between faculty, curators, and archivists, as well as digital innovators, create new points of access to share and learn information. Barnard Teaches is in its 8th and final year, and campus has changed a lot. Most recently, this change was driven by adapting to the pandemic, but when the grant was awarded, we had less support for digitally minded pedagogy. Today, we have a robust system housed in the Milstein Center and beyond. Here are some of our partners. For each course, each course granted students access to major New York City institutions. For example, at the Met, curators guided students through 18th century period rooms. At the New York Historical Society, students handled objects from the museum's collection, and a curator at the Billy Rose Theater Dance Division at the New York Public Library team taught students, introducing them to the archives and digital skills as well. Students were also eligible to apply for selective internships in the summer with curators and archivists that they met in class. The courses, we had 8 in total. Some are still going. There's too much to share in such a short time, so I'll briefly go through the courses taught by faculty who are not on the panel here today. First is The Worlds of Enzake Shange and Digital Storytelling by Kim Hall. Students explored the worlds of Enzake Shange, speaking to the artist herself, while guided by archivists at the Schomburg Center and the Barnard Archives. Students collaborated on a digital archive to house individual projects ranging from podcasts to art pieces. Just a note, if you see a faculty member in orange, that's highlighting they're here on the panel today. Paul Scolari's Digital Footprints course. Students worked with an archives and library team at the Jerome Robbins Dance Division to explore digital and on-site collections. Students then used Columbia's multimedia platform MediaThread to juxtapose annotated text with the visual archival material they collected. We'll skip ahead to the environmental visualizations of New York City by Kadambari Baxi, Karen Fairbanks, and Meg McLaughlin. Students explored the archives at the New York Public Library's map division and collaborated with local organizations to investigate past and current environmental impacts in New York City and went on field visits to disaster sites. Final projects employed digital skills to propose architectural solutions. In the Biology, Plants, and Profit course by Hilary Callahan, students utilized resources at the New York Botanical Garden, like the Herbarium and Mertz Library, as well as on-campus resources like the Arthur Ross Greenhouse to research biodiversity and contribute to projects like the digitization of Barnard's Herbarium. And then finally, Elizabeth Hutchinson's exhibiting modern Inuit sculpture. The Brooklyn Museum guided students through its collection of Indigenous art and facilitated discussions on the colonization of Indigenous art worlds. Students are currently creating physical and digital exhibitions that also draw from the collection of Inuit art at Columbia University's art properties. So I'm happy to introduce you to our panelists, Anne Iganay, the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of Art History and instructor of A Virtual Enlightenment, Meredith Lynn, Assistant Professor of Historical Archaeology at the Bard Graduate Center, who taught the New York City's Gilded Ages course. Unfortunately, Heather Nichols is not able to join us today as she is sick, and we're wishing her well. And then finally, Hannah Worthen, who is Associate Professor of Theater and Performance Studies, who taught the Ecologies of Transmedia Performance course. And I'm excited to introduce you to Melanie Hibbert, who is our moderator today. She's the director of IMATS and the Sloat Media Center. So I welcome Melanie to take the lead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for all that you have done. I've started at Barnard almost 7 years ago, and Barnard Teaches was one of the first projects that I was involved with. So it's exciting to kind of see this all come together in this type of way. And I've had the privilege of working with the wonderful panelists here on all of their courses as well. And I'll just say, they're so truly interesting and engaging. And I imagine the students who were part of these courses really gained so much from them. And, and I also think just from the general ed requirements around thinking technically and digitally, that these courses really embody, using digital tools around knowledge production, as well as, other forms of assessment. I think all educators have had to adapt so much of their courses during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think educators have really had to embody resilience and flexibility in order to adapt to the online space. I think this is especially the case with courses where there is a large physical component. Professor Hannah Worthen is in the theater department. How do you take a theater course and move it online? I think that's like one of the things that many faculty had to be creative and kind of come up with solutions. And what does that mean for courses where there's other physical components that are so important, such as museum spaces or working with physical objects? So I'm excited to kind of have this conversation this morning to reflect about the shift to remote, but also to think about embodiment in the physical spaces and, and what this looks like moving forward. What do we take with us and what do we leave behind? I'm thinking we can start with just introductions and maybe explaining a little bit about the course. And I'm wondering if we can go Anne to Meredith to Hannah.
All right, I'm Anne Egonay, and I taught a Barnard Teaches course called A Virtual Enlightenment. It worked with MET curators to imagine how some of their most valuable but underused galleries could respond to contemporary issues through virtual interventions.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Meredith Lynn. I co-taught a course with Kimberly Johnson, who was then in political science at Barnard, called New York City's Gilded Ages. And what we did in the course, our objective was to have students think about how our current age of extreme economic inequality had some kind of relationship with the first Gilded Age at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. We worked with largely with the New York Historical Society, but there were two iterations of the course, and the first was really based in New York Historical and really zeroed in on objects. The second iteration of the course was more open and more focused on landscape and neighborhood. We continued to partner with New York Historical on that iteration, but also with the Lower East Side Tenement Museum and the Frick Museum, really giving a sense of the 1% and how the other half lives in Jacob Riis's terms. Sarah Green assisted our course throughout, which is fantastic, especially on the technical side, which Kim and I were not up to speed on. That was the first iteration was 2015, so it was well before we had entered this new digital age. And also Melanie Hibbert provided us with great support in IMATS, and Jenny Correa in Barnard's library. So we had a lot of Barnard staff support in addition to the partnerships we had at outside institutions.
So hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Worthen, and the Barnard Teaches course I was offering was called Ecologies of Transmedia Performance. It was developed in partnerships with the New York Public Library for Performing Arts. Particularly, I collaborated with the curator of the Billy Rose Theater Division, Doug Preside. And the course consisted of 2 parts. It had a seminar that was led by me, and then it did have a lab, a digital lab that was led by Doug. And the goal of the course was to engage the New York Public Library's theater archive and to design an environmentally, socially, culturally self-aware transmedia performance. So this means that the students were creating individual and group projects that were then envisioned or designed to be dispersed across different media or different platforms. And each project did contribute to the main idea of the transmedia performance, but also all the projects together. And the unifying or coordinated idea of the transmedia performance was built around our desire to enlarge and enhance the human animal's capacity for interspecies performance. So the material we work with that was accessible to us at the beginning, of the pandemic was were historical documents or historical archival material pertaining to the 1935 production entitled Jumbo. It was a production that was produced for the Hippodrome Theater here in New York. And as the title is already anticipating, is that at the center of this production was a living elephant named Big Rosie. So, in our thinking, so how could we take this material and make out of it a meaningful transmedia performance for us today? So when we were asking this question, we decided to explore Rosie's performance, her historical, circumstances, and that led us then to ask questions that were addressing the deployment and representation of non-human animals for profit entertainment and conservation industries. So we took this elephant's historical performance as a kind of critical opening through which we could study her biography and other female elephants' lived experiences in the US. And then we were trying, to look from this opening, what's happening with the elephants and their experiences today in the United States as well. And we were very lucky because what we discovered is that in New York, so here next to us, we have a fellow New Yorker, an elephantine named Happy in Bronx Zoo. And the Non-Human Right Project is right now trying to appeal for Happy legal personhood. So we were able to connect the historical performance of an elephantine to current circumstances of an elephant with whom we share our living space and create a transmedia performance around it.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Meredith and Anne. So to kind of pose a big question for all of you. There are some clear differences in how one teaches and learns in physical spaces versus digital spaces, but there might also be some principles that transcend this divide, knowing it's not necessarily a binary, right? But what do you all think about this? And are there principles that you can apply to both the physical and the digital?
Well, okay, I'll leap in and say that even when we're learning in completely traditional ways, we're using our imagination to get close to things that are far away or to transcend time. That's what we do in our courses. And there are technical ways in which digital technology allows us to do that very intensely, allows us to get very, very close to objects, which have to be, so sorry, some kind of alarm going off. Why don't I go, oh wait, it stopped, magic. So, we can get very, very close to objects that are, for conservation reasons, not usually accessible to us. And also through digital technology, we can recreate embodied experiences from the past in a way that just furthers what it is we've always done. That's it.
I guess to build on that, in terms of furthering things that we've already done, dissemination, sharing of research is something that we've always done, and thinking about kind of the outputs, the projects that the students created. I think most of the classes, if not all of them, had some kind of digital output, which enables students to think about presentation in other formats than maybe a traditional paper or a traditional presentation, and can reach a much wider audience. So that's maybe an amplification and a way of providing more creative, different options for sharing research through the digital.
And when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking, so how did this class help me to, or how did it facilitate a learning environment? So not an environment where I was knowing what I'm doing and teaching that knowledge, but how it created an environment within which we could collaborate and what was needed for this collaboration. And because we were working on empathy and with empathy, I started to think, so what is needed for a successful collaboration? And it seems to me that it's establishing a connection with the students, and through the connection, establishing a trust between us. And it seems to me that that trust that we did have and the connection that we were able to establish, then that transcend the separation between me being an instructor and the students being the students. And I have to say that for my class, what seemed to be at the beginning very difficult to deal with was the fact that a few weeks before we started the course, we discovered that we cannot use the material that we did plan to use. And the material that we could then use was something unknown for me. So I did have to declare at the beginning of the class to my students that the material that we will be studying is outside of my field, of my expertise, and it's also something that I would be learning together with them. And that was surely also an aspect that contributed to the fact that we were able to connect. And throughout the class, I was aware of what I am doing, but more intuitively. And that was to be maintaining this connection, and it put me into a position of a facilitator. Like I felt that I'm in the service of the projects that we are doing, and my role is to make them successful. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for those answers. I mean, just the themes around establishing empathy and trust, accessing the past, collapsing space and time, and then student output. I think these are such powerful themes. I'm wondering, this moment that we're in has felt very hybrid. I know IMATS has helped support Anne's course at moments when there's students who have needed to quarantine, and so you have some students who are remote, and we're still in this transitional kind of hybrid space. And so I'm just curious, what are some things that you all plan to take with you as we kind of enter next year, and what are some things you want to leave behind, both from kind of remote and hybrid? It's sort of a big question, but.
Well, of course, access to teaching in emergency situations, we've really got that one down. I don't think we're ever going to need to ask ourselves again what to do when a student gets catastrophically ill or has some terrible emergency at home. And then I think we've become much, much more flexible about bringing guest speakers into our courses, because we've realized technology enables that at a fraction of the cost and bother. And I think in the most general way, our minds have been blown open to the possibilities of interaction in chat rooms, in breakout rooms, in all kinds of ways that have fragmented the old style monolithic teaching. I think we are now willing to teach in multiple modes within one class session and across a semester.
Thank you. And I don't know if Meredith or Hannah, you want to add as well?
Yeah, so for me, when I'm thinking through my class, so I am proposing or I'm designing right now another class that's taking on the interspecies aspects, and that will be about interspecies performance. So that's one aspect that I bring with me into the future. And the other aspect is that Doug Reside and we do plan a further collaboration, and it has to do with one of the final projects that a group of students did create. And that project is an interactive fiction game that's constructed around Big Rosie's story, so around the elephantine story that performed in Jumbo. And we are thinking now that it would be wonderful if Doug could teach a class, an interactive fiction game. And if we could begin to think through the interactive fiction game and how it uses language and how it codes language in terms of translation studies theories.
I guess I would add to these already great ideas and comments that I agree with totally is the possibility that digital projects allow for greater collaboration amongst students, like the kind of structure that they can form, that I think was possible before the epidemic, but we've sort of realized the ways that we can make use of, I don't know, Mind courses. We often now have a course website and students contribute questions or comments before class that everyone can see. But then the projects allow students to work together online at convenient times. I mean, I think it's also really important for students to be able to get together in the same room from time to time, because that's a different kind of collaborative experience that I would not want to leave behind. But the ability to kind of leave a note on a Google Doc, or to, fill out part of a web page and then have a conversation later, I think makes for a much more kind of productive, immersive, and convenient, frankly, experience for students constructing group projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the way in which digital technology changes classes is that there are fluid exchanges among students when they're out of sight of the faculty, and using Google Docs and conducting ongoing discussions has turned out to be a tremendous tool, which is completely compatible with in-person teaching. Actually, I've even learned just last week how to project Google Docs that students participate in through the chat during lecture classes. That
a game changer, yes.
Oh, and thanks to the CEP, that's where I got the idea.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Can't thank Google Docs and CEP enough in general. I'm wondering, I kind of want to ask some specific questions about your course. I'm going to start with Meredith. So I was fortunate enough to support your course on the Gilded Ages, and I got to accompany a class field trip to the Tenement Museum, where we had a private tour from a curator, which was just an incredible experience. And for those of you who haven't been able to go to the Tenement Museum, I highly recommend it. It teaches through physical objects, and it almost is like a simulation where you're taking a tour of a historically restored apartment, and you learn about immigrant and migrant families who actually lived there. And it's a very tactile, embodied experience. And I still very vividly remember the reception, which included food, immigrant food at the time. There was sauerkraut and dumplings, and all sorts of really good things. It was a very sensory experience. And so can you just talk about how this embodied physical experience enhanced the teaching and learning of your course?
Yeah, thanks so much. That was a very memorable visit. And I too encourage you all to go to the Tenement Museum if you haven't been. I think the points that you made about the embodied experience are really important. We know that students learn in different ways. Some students are more receptive to, reading, hearing, to kinesthetic experiences, but I think all of our learning, everyone's learning can be enhanced when we engage different senses. And there are some things that just are much more vivid and easy to understand and memorable when you experience it within a space. I'm thinking about, I can tell students that, life in a tenement in New York City was a difficult experience. Because there was a lot of labor involved, bringing water upstairs or cleaning spaces or whatever. But when they're in the stairwell, the dimly lit stairwell of a tenement building with, creaky, narrow stairs and an unstable handrail, and they think about, what would it be like to carry heavy loads, a child, wearing the dress of the day. That's a very different kind of imaginative experience that conveys a lot more than me just telling someone or them reading about it, or even seeing a photograph or a drawing of that same space. I also think, place, one of the lessons of the pandemic for me has been how memory, my own memory, is place-based. how I have a much harder time remembering things if they're all happening in the same space. You know, a lot of which, you know, are the tile screens that we're looking at now. But I remember things much better if the sensory experience around them was distinctive. So I think that there's that aspect of field trips, making learning just much more memorable. And then I think, you know, some of the things that people who study creativity talk about is how parameters on making, you know, kind of formulas or pre-existing ways of, say, making a ceramic pot, one might think are constraining, but in fact inspire creativity if there are some kind of parameters. And I almost think of the physical space as a kind of learning parameter that then makes imagination of what might have gone on in those spaces different. And one of the kinds of creative conversations that we might have also is thinking about how our own embodied experience might actually be quite different from other people's experience in the past or in the present. You know, that, and that's sort of a lesson that if we're all in the same space, we might talk about how it is that actually we perceive the space somewhat differently, depending on like our own experiences, our own abilities, what we bring to that space. So I think that there's a lot those are just some of the things that I can come up with off the top of my head, but I think there's a lot to that teaching within spaces can offer. And we have so many options in New York City that are, you know, are so easy to get to, relatively easy to get to from Barnard's campus.
Thanks for that answer. You know, I think kind of a sort of leads into a question I have for Anne, you know, just thinking about, right, physical space and the parameters of physical space. You know, and one thing that's always stood out to me about your course is how it combines the tactile, tangible objects, specifically the decor and furniture from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 18th century period rooms with the digital. And students have created just such dynamic and engaging projects based off of this, using, you know, tools like Photoshop as part of their scholarship. And, you know, and there's one project in particular that I always go back to as just such an exemplary, you know, way. So it's an exemplary project of how one can use digital tools for their scholarship. And unfortunately, Heather is not here today, but what she did, and you can speak to this much better than I can, but she was able to kind of Photoshop in servants who were working in the Met room to sort of demonstrate, you know, who was actually in those spaces the most often, and how do you make invisible labor more visible. And this was all grounded in actual historic research at the time of, you know, how many servants were working in these spaces. But yeah, I don't know if you can just talk about like the relationship between these physical objects and the digital projects, and you know, and about this maybe this project in particular. So yeah, hand it over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to channel Heather here. She was going to show you some of the images that she made. So I'll do share screen here. We took as our starting point some of these extremely opulent period rooms in the Met. Of course, there have been paintings ever since the rooms were made that showcased their use by the owners of those rooms. But what Heather brilliantly thought of doing was to, through Photoshop, allow people to understand that those rooms were inhabited even more by those who worked in them than those who owned them. So she made a Photoshop like this that showed an interaction between owners and servants. She showed it at different times of day. And she also did Photoshops that showed the endless hours of tedious maintenance labor that went into these rooms. So she literally made the labor that sustains the rooms visible. And I've used these Photoshop images over and over again in teaching, and I've showed them to museum curators, and they're always a complete game changer. When people see the results of research, they suddenly think of the rooms and all the objects in them completely differently from a new perspective. I wish Heather had been able to show it to you.
Yeah, it's such a powerful project. And yeah, that's wonderful that you actually, not only are you using it, or was that used to build upon future courses, but that you've incorporated it into your own instruction. Yeah, it speaks to the power of that. I have a question for Hannah. You know, your course, you had to adapt your Barnard Teaches course, you know, to an online platform, and which is unique of the three courses here, as far as adapting your specific Barnard Teaches course online. And, you know, how were you able to do this? And, you know, what surprised you?
Yeah, so I was able to do it because the support of this class was so terrific. I mean, Sarah Green supported, you know, me and Doug from the very beginning. And I do remember the meeting we did have when I learned that I will not be able to use the material that we planned to use, really few weeks, days before the class supposed to begin. And I didn't know what to do. And it was a very difficult moment, but the support I received was terrific. As I said, both from Sarah and from Doug. And so then we decided to go with the course forward and with the material that we were all then exploring throughout the semester. And what surprised me was how dedicated the students were to their projects. And I mean, they were so dedicated that I was telling us in our meeting that we do need to step back and take some, you know, and make sure that we not work the entire time. So this was, you know, a group of students wanted to do a digital reconstruction of the music used in this show. And it involved a lot of mechanical labor transcribing the music, and it took a considerable amount of time. And so for them, in order to actually work with the music, they did need to do this basic work. And when I see the hours they were spending, you know, on it, I tried with Doug together, we tried kind of to limit the work they were spending on the songs, but they were so dedicated that they didn't want to listen to us. So that was, I was very surprised by that dedication. Yeah. And I think, just if I can add to it, you know, I think that the transmedia project, kind of, it also fosters kind of responsibility and accountability towards each other. Because if my project begins to fail, I am in a way like letting down the project as a whole. And we did have an agreement with each other that if some of us get stuck, we are a group of people and any one of us can step in and help. That's the one thing I wanted to add. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I have one final question for the three of you, and then we'll open it up to see if others here have questions. And I'm wondering if you all can speak about how your students' engagement with spaces in New York City, has changed, or, has that impacted the way that you teach in general? And how do we engage our neighboring institutions as additional Barnard classrooms?
Well, going into a course, students are resistant to having to travel anywhere. There's an initial feeling that it's just going to be a big bother. And invariably, by the end of semester on the course evaluations, what the students will say is, oh, I discovered New York. I had no idea. And now I feel like I am in control of my relationship to the whole city. They'll say, not only do I feel totally comfortable in a museum, but I bring my friends, I bring my parents. They have a completely different experience of what it means to be at Barnard here in New York.
I mean, so for my class, we didn't have the possibility or the opportunity to work in the physical space of the New York Public Library for the performing arts. But I hope that since the students now have a connection with the curator of the theater division there, I very much hope that through that, they would take on projects that they would take on projects that would be connected to the historical material in the library and go to explore that material.
Yeah, and to add on that, I think it opened up students' eyes to all of the other resources that might not have been part of the course, but that are on offer in New York. Just they had a broader sense of what might be out there and what they could do in other courses and beyond Barnard.
It gives them also a lot of incentive to seek out internships and employment in the city, because they have a feeling for how New York is a place that includes so much more than Barnard and Columbia.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone has questions.
Can I ask, I want to ask Jennifer a question. So Jennifer, you who know so much about how to teach, what do you think the take-home lesson is for faculty from Barnard Teaches? What do you think we could do now to make our teaching more flexible and more engaging?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I just think listening to these, all of these really thoughtful classes that were put together, and I should tell you all, I was in a class like this as an undergrad. It was a very early version. It was a history course in which we used a media lab to put kind of our project together, and it was that course that was the reason I decided to get a PhD in media studies, and my focus was media education. Was actually and so it's been nice listening to this and hearing these as someone who was a humanities undergrad. I do think that it had kind of that type of effect on me. It was clearly had a major impact on me. And so I think that these types of classes where you're both, I mean, just even Sarah, your first few slides where you're just demonstrating all the locations in New York that these types of classes went to. I mean, and then I think, to one of the points you made, Hannah, about the humility and openness of being able to teach something that you're not a full expert in. I mean, I think that risk taking is something that, we want to promote with our students. And I think kind of owning that and naming that for them, and being willing to take those risks, I think is a really important step to take, and something I we love to emphasize at the CEP, but I do think that's been really exemplified today in the examples we've seen here. And I think that there's a lot of work that goes into these classes as well. And so I think acknowledging the amount of both being able to kind of move with the class and what happens, that risk taking, but also the preparedness, the people, connecting with Melanie and the IMS, all the work that goes into these courses and the people. I think acknowledging that is also really important aspect of something that I learned here, and it was very visible, I would say, in today's presentations.
If I can add to it, what was invaluable for me is the collaboration with Doug Reside. Also, in addition to our students. And this was also a surprising aspect for me, because we didn't know each other. And we went into co-teaching of this class, of this course, without knowing how do we think, what do we value, how do we work with the material that we use for our research. Yeah, and I think that for the students then also to see how we too did collaborate with each other, and offered a model how to relate and how to think about collaboration. Yeah.
I wanted to say also that from the point of view of the students, for example, when I incorporate all these activities as part of the course, I think it's easier for the students to take part of them if I have them like as something supplemental of an extra activity. I don't feel the students are motivated towards doing it. So I think having the students be guided into exploring all these amazing places at New York City in part of a course, I think has a really good impact on the students. I'm just talking like recently I'm inviting my students to a play, and it was just an outside activity. And I had a couple of students saying like, no, I'm sorry, I don't have time for that. And so it's like, oh, okay. So if I had it part of the course from the beginning and having a weight on the class somehow, probably they will be more inclined to participate. Probably the grade will be a motivation, but having it as an outside activity, only like I can only recruit just like less than half of the students.
Jennifer pointed out how much work these courses are. And you all have mentioned all the support that you've gotten from the CEP, IMATS, the curators that you worked with, and of course, Sarah has been here all this time, it's so helpful with so many of the difficult logistics, and that is, that's also expensive, and we know that this was grant funded. And so I think there's only so many grants that you can continue to get to do engaged pedagogy. And so I'm wondering what the college can do to make this sort of more practical and possible for our faculty.
Well, one of the things that I think the university has already done is partnered with, or they have an agreement with many city institutions for free admission. So at least that reduces the barrier to bringing students to places. They don't have to pay for admission. And one way maybe to lower the amount of faculty time and investment could be to ask students to go to institutions on their own. I mean, I think there are plenty of curators who would be willing and interested to give tours or talks or behind the scenes glimpses for no cost. And that would also relieve the burden of teaching that particular class on the faculty member. But another option, if that's not possible, is to ask students and build this into the syllabus. I think Maria's point is really a good one. Build it into the syllabus that, you know, students are required to visit a particular institution or exhibition, and maybe have an assignment around that where they reflect on what they see. And discuss it in the classroom. So it doesn't have to be that every outside trip is really coordinated and choreographed and requires extra funding and extra people. It could be that some of this is done by students on their own, but then you bring their experiences back into the classroom. I mean, that would be a shoestring kind of way to involve students. And actually there was a summer internship in between the 2 semesters of the Gilded Ages course that we did have funding support for 2 students to go around to the city and take photographs and create a web page, and the students were compensated, which I think is really important, and something that the college can do also, is make sure that they, if there are kind of internship opportunities affiliated with a class or extra work outside the class, thinking about monetary compensation for that for students. At the very least, providing them with Metro cards or transportation fees could be really important. But that internship was also kind of a relatively low cost way to send students out into the city to do dynamic work on their own in pairs, in one pair.
Yeah, and I just want to respond to Melissa's question in the chat about scaffolding this whole thing. I love that word you use, scaffolding, because it helps me realize that I'm more oriented now to investing my teaching time in creating the scaffolding and then letting the students climb all over it. And I'll put more time up front setting up the Google Docs or the research projects. And then I make students do much more work. Like one trick I used in the pandemic, which has had lasting consequences, is I got students to do 2-minute presentations to each other on course material instead of teaching it myself. So I let go of the authority in the classroom, and I was amazed at how teaching each other brings out the pride and the work ethic of students, and they'll do so much to impress and instruct each other. And then you just sit back and listen.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Anne said. And, you know, for us, it was the fact that we were all discovering the historical circumstances of the production as the course was progressing. And we were all bringing into the seminar sessions our discoveries. And I mean, I found it very motivating for all of us. And we were very excited about the next session and what we would learn. But because we were discovering the materials, we were going around, I couldn't scaffold, you know, so much. And the plus side of that was that it kept us to be present, kind of, to each other and present to the material.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think we are at about time. I feel like I could keep talking about this for another hour because I think it's just so interesting. You know, how do we adapt to remote? What do we take with us? Yeah, how do we scaffold things? You know, and I'm not even a faculty member, but I just, yeah, think this is also interesting. But yeah, I sincerely want to thank Anne and Meredith and Hannah, just, you know, for allowing me to just engage with your courses, which was just a wonderful experience. and for coming today to the panel. And then of course, to thank Sarah for all the work that you've done in facilitating and coordinating Barnard Teaches courses. So yeah.
And thanks to our moderator who did a wonderful job and is very much appreciated. All right, so on that note, I'm going to power down this event and thank you all for coming. It's great to see everybody.